Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me here. Kind of first of a series of Zoom lectures with the Lansu Chinese Garden. I'm speaking to you from my living room at home. And today I wanted to start by introducing this book. It's called Classical Chinese Medicine, and it's written by Dr. Liu Lihong. The reason why I wanted to introduce the book is for someone who studies Chinese medicine, or even for the layperson who doesn't have a lot of experience with Chinese medicine. This book serves as an excellent introduction to that whole topic. Dr. Liu Lihong has sort of become my mentor over the past 5 years or so. I translated his book, started translating it in 2013, or 2012 rather, and completed the translation in 2014. And then it was accepted for publication by the Chinese University Hong Kong Press in 2016. And at that point, once it was finally kind of accepted, and I felt like I could sort of face him, I went to China and met up with Dr. Liu and formed a friendship with him as a student primarily. I was going back there every year at least once, some years a couple of times, to meet with Dr. Liu. Since the pandemic began, I haven't been back to see him. So I haven't been back to see him since October of 2019. Dr. Liu's book has been translated as Classical Chinese Medicine, which I think is a good title for the English version of the book, because it sort of puts his work under a single heading and allows you to understand how what he's talking about really refers to classical Chinese medicine. But the original Chinese version had a different title. It was 思考中医. And I'd like to introduce that title to you. So this, I'm not expecting you to know Chinese, but maybe you do, I don't know. 思考中医 literally means contemplating or thinking or considering Chinese medicine. And these characters are worth exploring it in a little more detail. So here we have this character, Si. This part here, this topmost part, which looks like a kind of a checkerboard, a very simple board. It is the Chinese character Tian, which means a field, like the type of field where you're planting or growing things. So you can kind of see this image of the furrows or the rows in the field. And in fact, in the oracle bone script, which is the earliest Chinese script, it was a script that was used by the shamans to predict the future or to sort of know something about the world. There was the very earliest written script was carved into tortoise plastrons and buffalo scapula. And in that form, it was sometimes written with far more of these kind of lines, these furrows in it. So you really could kind of see a field in it. And sometimes it was even more irregular. It would have kind of an irregular shape with all these lines in it, kind of depicting this piece of ground, perhaps surrounded by uneven ground that was leveled out, and furrows and rows were made into it. So it's this notion of taking a piece of earth that might have stones and weeds, and the ground may be compacted in places, it may be too high in places, too low in others, and working it over, and through kind of like hard work over time, turning it into a kind of more regular and even piece of ground where water can flow more easily and where things can grow, kind of making it more fertile. This lower portion here, Xin, means heart or mind. probably one of the most important Chinese characters in terms of understanding Chinese medicine, this notion of the heart or mind. And there we have the concept of, the thought or consciousness. So together, this idea, this character, means to really ponder, to kind of sit and ruminate, to think about something at length, not just to kind of calculate something, but to really kind of go over it again and again. The second character, Kao, means to test or to examine, to verify something. So Dr. Liu's book, in this book, Classical Chinese Medicine, it is full of Kao, of his contemplations, his ponderings, but it's also full of his ideas, his thoughts, and then he illustrates how in the real world he put them into practice and attempted to kind of examine them or verify whether or not they were truly effective, or whether or not they were they were real or true. So in the book, he'll start sometimes with a passage from the Chinese classics, something that was written 2,000 years ago, a single line. He'll talk about how that line of classical writing was maybe conveyed to him or pointed out to him by a teacher who was using it in the clinic. And then you see how he takes that information and he himself uses it in the clinic. He embellishes it with his own study, and he kind of fleshes it out and brings it to life. These next two characters, Zhongyi. Zhongyi is the Chinese for Chinese medicine, but this character here, Zhong, though it can mean Chinese, China is Zhongguo, the central kingdom. Zhong can mean Chinese. It also just means central, or kind of the middle of something, within something. And it was originally written like a flag, showing some sort of fabric or banner unfurling. It was at times even written something like this, where you could see the flag unfurling. So the character Zhong, it somehow conveys this idea, and it's something Dr. Liu tried to explain to me at my first meeting with him, was this notion of something coming from the center and unfurling and growing out into the world. This Zhong, something emerging from, the middle of things. And then Yi is medicine. And in this character, medicine, we see up here, this was originally kind of a picture of kind of arrows or pointed objects that were used. So it referred to acupuncture. This portion here referred to a hollow bamboo tube. So back in ancient times, they would take a bamboo tube that was closed at one end, open at the other, put flame inside it, and then place that tube on the body, and that would produce suction. This is what we now use for cupping, to move kind of stagnant blood and fluid beneath the surface of the skin, and relieve pain and whatnot. And then down here, this character refers to, it would have been written as sort of like a gourd, where some sort of decoction or liqueur, some sort of herbal medicine of sorts would be stored. So in this character, Yi, we have acupuncture, we have the kind of more physical type of modality of treating physical ailments, and then we have the character for formulas or for herbs. Altogether, we have this 思考中医, which is contemplating Chinese medicine. And that was, of course, translated into English as classical Chinese medicine. But the subtitle of Dr. Liu's book, I think, is also interesting. He has 思考中医, and then the subtitle is 对自然与生命的时间解决. So basically, that subtitle means it's an explanation or a discussion of nature and life and time. So in Dr. Liu's book, he constantly rotates between these sort of three themes: nature, the larger macrocosm, the world around us, the natural world, but also the sun and the moon. He goes into important kind of concepts in physics, and even newer concepts that have emerged from quantum physics, or an understanding of the universe at large. And then the human body and life in general, how it's situated within that larger macrocosm. And he also looks a lot at time, how things change through time, and how disease processes are affected by the cyclical nature of time. His book is divided in my mind, it's divided into two parts. And for the layperson, the first couple hundred pages of the original, which are probably about 250 or so pages of the translation, in a way constitute its own book. The second half of the book is a detailed discussion of the treatise on cold damage, which is the earliest classical Chinese medical clinical guide. That book, though it's not the earliest Chinese medical classic, which is the Yellow Emperor's internal classic, or the Huangdi Neijing, but the Shanghan Lun, which was, and this is my favorite English version of that book, which was written by Zhang Zhongjing, is the book that Dr. Liu constantly refers back to. And to maybe give you a little bit of a kind of a sense of the way Dr. Liu practices and teaches in China now, he has schools all through China. And when he meets with his students, they all stand and they recite from memory if they can. If not, they read it off of a projection in front of them, the preface of Zhang Zhongjing's book. And that preface starts with Zhang Zhongjing himself, who was this incredible physician, giving praise to a previous physician who was sort of like in his mind the greatest physician. So the first line is Yu Mei Lan Yue Ren Ru Guo Zhi Zhan Wang Qi Hou Zhi Si Wei Chang Bu Kai Ran Tan Qi Cai Xu Ye, which basically translates to, every time I think about the physician Yue entering the kingdom of the Marquis of Qi, and looking at his complexion, and by looking at his complexion, being able to accurately diagnose his disease. Every time I think of that, it never fails to evoke in me a sigh of admiration. And the rest of the preface goes into talking about how Chinese medicine, or the study of medicine itself, is not just a way to improve our own bodies, but it's a way to help the people that we love, and allow our parents to live longer, and that kind of thing. The reason why I bring that up is the very first part of Dr. Liu's book, he talks about the way he learned Chinese medicine in the formal Chinese medical system. So in the middle of the 20th century, after the communists came to power, they made a concerted effort to take the kind of very variegated landscape of Chinese medicine, where from one city to the next, from one province to the next, from one practitioner to the next, Chinese medicine was practiced differently. Pulse diagnosis was different. Tongue diagnosis was different. The way diseases were treated were different. Everything was very idiosyncratic. It was by nature and very individualized type of medicine. They wanted to take that, they wanted to distill it out and systematize it so that it could be taught in universities in much the same way that Western medicine is taught in the West, in the United States, where you have, first a series of courses where you're getting the basics, and then you're learning these individual fields. You have a standardized treatment protocol for each type of medicine. So when Dr. Liu was in school, that was how he was being taught. But he found that he really learned the most from his individual interactions and his individual study with these particular practitioners, with his teachers. And that type of study was the way that Chinese medicine has been taught since its beginning, essentially, up until the middle of the 20th century. It was almost always this relationship between the practitioner, the kind of master physician, and the student, who would shadow the physician, would study or learn whatever it was that that physician told them to study and learn, would watch that person in practice, would learn all these formulas, would kind of assist the physician any way that they could. And they would form a type of relationship that was, in many respects, closer and tighter even than you might have with your parent or with a member of your own family. But in the modern system of Chinese medicine, that was completely lost. Students would come in, and this is in China, students would come in, they'd sit in a classroom, they'd have a lecture, they'd take notes, they'd go home, they'd study the information, they'd come back, they'd be given a test, they'd take the test, they were scored on that. And Dr. Liu points out how this way of teaching Chinese medicine divorces Chinese medicine from its kind of living body, which is the relationship that the physician has with the patient and the relationship that the physician has with the student. And that kind of relationship centered learning was what what allowed Chinese medicine to be kind of truly or deeply understood. So he talks about that, and then he goes into a discussion of even how Chinese medicine is regarded and practiced in modern China, and how different that was from the past. So, for instance, in Zhang Zhongjing's preface to the Shanghanmen, to the treatise on cold damage, he first starts out by talking about how 7/10 of his clan members, so back then people lived in these large clans, they could be 400 or 500 or even 1,000 people. They'd have almost like their own little town, these complexes of large buildings and whatnot. They'd form a large clan. 7/10 of his clan members were wiped out by what he called cold damage, or what Dr. Liu refers to as damage to the cold. So a type of epidemic disease, a contagious epidemic disease. And if you think about 70% of the people, 70% of those people dying of his clan members, and this is what propelled him into medicine in the first place. This is back 2,000 years ago. 70% of his clan members dying is far worse than anything that we're experiencing today, say with COVID. In many respects, those numbers, when you look at the bubonic plague, where a third or a half of populations were destroyed. This was a very contagious type of disease that raged through his family, his clan, and killed everyone. So he saw Chinese medicine as a system that could deal with that type of very dangerous, very potentially deadly disease. But when he got into the clinic, and he talks about this and gives really excellent description of it in his book, when he got into the clinic, he found that not only was Chinese medicine relegated to students that weren't strong enough or ambitious enough, say, to study Western medicine, but in the hospital setting, Chinese medicine was really treated as sort of a sideshow, as complementary medicine. And he gives this example of how if someone were in the Chinese medical ward of the hospital and they had an elevated fever for more than a couple of days, they would have to be transferred to the Western medicine department for treatment. So you have a patient, you're treating them, they may be improving, they may not, but you've been treating them for 2 days. And at the end of those 2 days, if they still have a fever, the Chinese medicine was no longer permitted to be used. They had to go and be treated by Western medical physicians. And he was just so baffled by this, because on the other hand, when patients were being treated by Western medical physicians, if after 2 days or even a week or even 3 weeks, they still had a fever and the Western medicine was failing to address the problem and deal with what is essentially a symptom and not even a disease, a fever. They were never sent to the Chinese medicine department for treatment. It was just kind of there was a sense that Chinese medicine wasn't real medicine, and that discussion of the way Chinese medicine is regarded and the way it was taught is part of the whole kind of mood or feel of Dr. Liu's book. And I feel like that very first part of his book is why this book was a bestseller in China. So this book was sort of a sensation. The original Chinese version was a sensation in China because it struck a chord with a real upswell of not just in the Chinese medical community, of people realizing and being frustrated with the limitations that Chinese medicine had in the modern system of medicine, but for the everyday Chinese person who might know nothing about Chinese medicine, it was saying, there's all this modern Western medicine that's from outside of China, that's from the West, but we have our own medicine that's equally good, that's been established for thousands of years. And so it struck in a way, a slightly kind of historical, kind of nationalist tone with the Chinese public. And I think that was a big part of why it became so popular, even just for the layperson. They might not get any further than the first couple hundred pages of the book, but they would buy it just to kind of read that and to look at the way that Chinese culture on the whole had internalized the Western cultures, or the Western world's condescension toward things that were truly Chinese, towards traditional Chinese culture in general. After he talks about those two facets of Chinese medicine, how it was traditionally taught, and then how it was traditionally regarded versus how it's regarded and treated today, Dr. Liu he introduces the reader to some very basic concepts in Chinese medicine. Probably the first of which is Yin and Yang. So most people are familiar with Yin and Yang, and we're almost all of us, I'm sure everyone actually, is familiar with the Yin Yang symbol, which isn't really even a very ancient symbol. This symbol came into popularity in the Yuan dynasty. So long after the Yellow Emperor's Classic and whatnot were written. But we have this notion of Yin and Yang as these two things being kind of separate. A little bit of the Yin and the Yang, a little bit of the Yang and the Yin. This kind of concept. Dr. Liu, right off the bat, he sort of dispels that notion of yin and yang. The way he describes yin and yang is in terms of the cycle of the seasons and in terms of time, and the way that energy is released and the way that energy is stored. And this concept is crucial in terms of understanding the rest of the book, especially where he gets into a discussion of the treatise on cold damage, or as he refers to it, damage to the cold. He thinks of yin and yang in this way. Yin is the kind of holding back or the drawing of the bow backwards, and yang is the release of the arrow, of it flying forth. So if you think about wintertime is when all of the energy goes down into the roots, everything's held back, everything's contained, all of the potential is amassed and concentrated out of sight, kind of down in the earth, or it's held in place. And then in springtime, that energy is released and everything comes forth and flourishes and is healthy. But if you think about a bow and arrow, when you draw the string back, If you only draw it back a little ways and you let the arrow go, it doesn't fly very far. It's just sort of this feeble thing. If you draw it back very far and then let go, it flies and it's very strong. So the yang energy, that active, outgoing energy, is dependent on the yin energy, the containing of that energy. And when the yang energy, when things aren't held back, when they're not held in place, they're not pulled all the way back and stored, and that potential isn't built up, then you have disease that emerges in the body once it is released. So he gives the example of in Chinese cosmology and kind of traditional Chinese thinking, farmers believe that if there is a snowfall kind of late in the spring, I suppose kind of like the snowfall that we had this year here in Portland, but if there's a snowfall late in the year and the winter is very cold and it stays cold all through the winter, that indicates that there's going to be a very healthy spring and summer, that there's going to be a healthy harvest and things are going to go very well. And, really that is very true. When we think about the snowpack on Mount Hood, the whether or not we get enough snow, we get enough precipitation, we get enough storage of that yin energy up on the mountain, that determines whether or not our summer is going to be beautiful. Everything will be verdant, and there'll be the rivers will be full of fish, and there'll be plenty of water to irrigate fields, and the lakes will be full. Or whether we'll kind of experience, say, a drought where we don't have enough water, or even potentially a famine if back in the day we didn't have enough water to tend our fields and to irrigate and whatnot. So this notion of yin and yang being this kind of dynamic through time is important to understand, because Dr. Liu Lihong, this book, this Shanghan Lun, it's almost always translated as cold damage. So people tend to think of the Shanghan Lun as somehow cold causing illness, as the cold damaging the person. But Dr. Liu points out that is not the case. And if you look at the preface to the Shanghan Lun, he is talking about what you might call febrile diseases. So diseases with very high fever that can kill someone very quickly. That's not instigated by cold. That's actually caused by heat. So where does this heat come from? Where does this fever come from? In Dr. Liu's understanding of the classics, and he points out how it jives very well with what's written in the Shanghan Lun. It's when the winter energy, when the yin energy, when the drawing back of the bow, that cold energy is damaged, when that's interfered with, when there isn't enough kind of storage of the yin, then when nature moves forward, all of these things can happen that are detrimental to health and that can cause disease. On a very simple example, you might think about insects. So you have a beautiful forest, but unless that forest gets cold enough for long enough to kill all of the kind of insects and beetles and things that live there, when summertime comes, diseases, it could be anything from beetles or anything like that, or it could be funguses, these types of things that are killed off and that are held in check by the cold kind of winter energy, they're able to flourish and they're able to cause disease in the forest and destroy it. So he looked at the type of epidemic or pandemic disease that he saw killing his clan members. He saw that as damage to the cold. So the Shanghan Lun is really a way of treating and preventing febrile diseases by maximizing the body's ability to kind of store and contain that type of yin energy. I hope, am I making sense so far? It's so odd speaking via Zoom, but anyway, I guess we'll get to questions. Okay, I see a thumbs up. That's great. I guess we'll get to questions kind of later in the lecture. So Dr. Liu's book, he looks at the macrocosm and the microcosm. He gives all of these examples of how the human body is like the natural world. One example that he uses, or he points to, is the fossil fuels that we have here on the planet. So for him, he sees that as the kind of the Jing essence, this kind of stored kind of elixir that the biosphere has sequestered underground and hidden. And it plays, a role that we don't really understand currently. There in the depths of the ground, we have natural gas and petroleum and oil shale, and these are sort of the culmination of millions and millions of years of living things sequestering carbon from the sun and storing it underground. And he sees that as kind of a correlate to the essence in the human body that should remain kind of contained, and that we should kind of cultivate and cherish, that will allow us to have kind of a long and healthy life. And he, in a way, draws a parallel between the use of fossil fuels and not only what using them does, say, to the natural world, but the way that the use of fossil fuels speeds up our own lives and distracts us from the natural world and divorces us from the kind of natural rhythms of the earth. And this type of technology, or technology that's driven by these types of fuels, then puts us into a scattered and distracted state, where we're no longer kind of focusing on things, where we're no longer sleeping at regular hours, where we're no longer connecting very deeply with our own natural world in a way that's meaningful. Another very important part of Dr. Liu's book is the way that he uses hexagrams from the Book of Changes. So we have these hexagrams, which are formed of either solid yang lines or broken yin lines. And these hexagrams were the creation of, or how can I say it? They were generated from the tradition of oracle bone divination. So back, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, when they were first using these turtle plastrons or water buffalo scapulae to make predictions or arrive at some understanding of the outside world, they would have the turtle plastron, which is the underside of the bottom, the stomach part of the turtle or the tortoise, and then the upper part, the carapace, is the rounded part. So you have the flat part on the bottom and this round part on the top, and you can kind of see how this bottom part has this kind of square or kind of this rectangular feature to it. In the earliest cosmological model of the cosmos, the heavens, the sky, was seen as being circular, and the earth down here on the earth was seen as being kind of square. And when you look at the human body, you have the bones that make up the head, they're very round. When you get down to the feet, the bones that make up the ankle and the parts of the body that are in contact with the earth, they tend to become very cuboid, very square. This kind of cosmological model, this was also the early model of a Chinese coin. So if you've ever seen a traditional Chinese coin, it's a circle with the square in it. It's kind of a little cosmological model there. But in any case, these turtle plastrons, what they would do is they would bore a hole, they drill a hole in the plastron, and then they would they would make two scores or two marks in it with some sort of sharp instrument. And on one side, they'd have a solid line, which was confirming some result. And then on the other side, they'd have a broken line, which was neither confirming nor denying a result. So this would be confirmatory, like a definite yes. And this was more like a maybe yes, maybe no. So the yin line originally was indefinite. It was a broken line. It was thought of as in Chinese philosophy, it's this concept of shu, which means it's plastic or indefinite. Whereas this line here would be solid or definite. So in the early oracle bone, on both the front and the back of the turtle plastron, the king might have his question. So it could be something like, tomorrow when we go hunting, I'm going to successfully capture or kill a tiger. And then there would be some sort of heat would be applied to this hole. They're still not clear what the heat source was, but it was something very hot. And that would cause a crack to suddenly form, either towards the definite yes or towards the maybe. So in cases, they would find that the question was repeated, and there may even be evidence that there was some sort of propitiations, some kind of sacrifices made to the spirits or the ancestors between the first asking and the second asking, when the questioner, who would have been the king or the ruler, was desiring a particular result. I'm just bringing that up to point out how this, in terms of early Chinese cosmology, these solid and broken lines were very much at the center of Chinese culture. So if you think about the beginning of Chinese writing happened on these plastrons and on these water buffalo scapulae. The first record that we have of these ideographs, these pictographs, coming into a two-dimensional form, forming a system of writing, it all happened on these plastrons, and it was all in order to determine a solid line or a broken line. Over time, this system of solid and broken lines became kind of a binary code in itself. And we have what we now know as the 64 hexagrams, which can be formed of any number of solid and broken lines. So for instance, here we have two solid lines and a broken line, and this forms a picture of a lake. And together, these two trigrams, consisting of 3 lines each, form the hexagram tui, which is lake, and it's often translated as joy or kind of happiness. Not really happiness, really more of a joy type of thing. It's not necessarily a positive hexagram if you're doing if you're consulting the oracle. It doesn't necessarily connote all the good things that we might think of when we think of joy. But in Dr. Liu's book, each time he discusses a part of the body or some macrocosmic event that's significant in terms of trying to understand Chinese medicine, he almost always goes back to these hexagrams and describes how this the book of changes, the Yi Jing, these hexagrams can provide us with insights into whatever it is he's discussing at the time. So for instance, if you look at the character for, or the hexagram that's associated with the spleen, it consists of all solid lines. So the spleen consists it's this qian, the creative. This is a hexagram that's associated with the spleen. So you would think that the spleen would be, something very like since it's all yang lines, it would be hot and active and strong and powerful. And the things that the spleen rules have a lot of that quality. So for instance, when the spleen is healthy, then the muscles, the flesh of the body is strong. When the spleen is healthy, the person has a lot of energy. They're able to focus. They don't suffer from damp maladies. They are, physically active and alert and I guess intelligent. They're able to think things through. This idea of this is the mental attribute or the kind of spirit that's housed in the spleen. But when you look at the actual organ of the spleen, it's anything but that. First of all, we tend to think of the spleen as or less and less so now, but historically, if someone's spleen was ruptured, it would be removed, and the notion was that really there was no kind of real detriment to the body. It's not like the heart, where if you have any little problem with the heart, it has a serious effect on the rest of the body. But the spleen was, the spleen is kind of thought of as an unnecessary organ. But when Dr. Liu kind of discusses how that organ interacts with the rest of the body and how it kind of keeps the rest of the body strong and active and whatnot, this hexagram then makes a lot more sense. I did want to talk a little bit about suppose I wanted to talk a little bit about Dr. Liu himself as a teacher and as a practitioner. I only have a couple of minutes left. I'm sorry for that last digression, but so you read the book and you kind of get a concept of Chinese medicine as a whole, but Dr. Liu himself really embodies, I feel, the traditional Chinese medical practitioner. Whenever we get on a plane to go anywhere, he travels a lot. So when I'm over there, oftentimes I'll kind of shadow him and go wherever he's going. He keeps in his wallet a little set of needles. And I don't think we've ever sat next to somebody on the plane without Dr. Liu doing acupuncture on them. He'll start talking to them. He'll, ask them a few questions. And before you know it, they'll have a needle in their hand, or they'll have a needle in their foot or something, and he'll be treating them. He's also one of these people who really kind of lives by what he talks about and is taught in the book. He follows the rhythms that are prescribed in the books. He keeps himself kind of covered from wind and from other kind of external things that could afflict him. And he himself is just such a devoted student of Chinese medicine. Even though he's now very established and he has lots of students himself, he has a study at the top of his house. He goes up there and drinks tea and just studies for hours, and has his patients come up there and he'll treat them and whatnot. I